Hi everyone, welcome to our second lecture video. And today we will be talking about arguing about literature. So the first week is the readings for the first week are pages 1 to 42 of the arguing about literature. So um, you should have read that by now. This lecture will make more sense to you if you did the reading. So I suggest doing that before watching the lecture. But before that, I have a couple of things that I want to point out. Final exam. Some of you are asking about the exact final exam date. There is no exact date for the final exam. That will be a take-home kind of exam, right? So I will give you the prompt for the final exam the week before finals, and then you will answer the prompt and answer the questions from the prompt, and then give that to me before on or before the 24th of July. So the 24th is the Friday. That's the Friday of the exam week, right? So so you can do the final exam at any time during the finals week, right? Okay, and what else? And so yeah, so these videos, I will not be able to talk about everything in the in your readings, right? So I will point out things that I think are important. But if there are parts that you want to talk about or you have questions about, right, that I did not mention in my lecture, then you will have to ask me that through email or through office hours, right? So just keep that in mind. And then I will also send you my notes. Along with this video, I will send you my notes. My notes has the quotes that I've taken from the book. And yeah, just my notes for this lecture so that you can, if you want, right, you can follow along with the notes as you listen to my lecture. Yeah, I think that's it for the announcements. And yeah, just make sure you're keeping in touch with me. Email me if you have any questions. And so yeah, I'll just jump right into the lecture. And so this is the book that you're supposed to be reading for this class, right? So this is the required book. Okay, so we'll start with chapter 1, right? So the chapter 1, the title is "What is Argument?" Right? And so for this class, right, based on what the title of the book is, arguing about literature, right? We are reading literature. We are reading short stories, and we're analyzing short stories, right? We're trying to understand them in a deeper way. And we are also arguing about them, right? And we want to sort of we want to interpret them a certain way, right? And we want to argue that our interpretation is strong because A, B, and C, right? So that's gonna be what that will be sort of, you know, the format of your essays for this class, right? Is you not only analyzing and interpreting, right, the literature, but also arguing, right, that your interpretation is good, that it's a strong interpretation, right? And then you will provide examples of why that is. Okay, so I will just start by reading the first couple of paragraphs on chapter 1, and this is included in the notes also, right? So, quote, "The first word in our book's title may puzzle you. Why would we want to argue? Are we really inviting you to yell or sneer? The word arguing may remind you that my may remind you of spats you regret, right? Almost everyone has suffered arguments like these. They arise in the media all the time. Cable news panels routinely lapse into squabbles. Guests feel required to clash. Social media outlets like Twitter are plagued by trolls, accounts that exist to insult and demean other people's posts. Celebrities may rebuke each other on Instagram, right? No wonder many people define arguing as a combat, right? It often seems like war, right? But our book is about arguing in a positive sense, right? We define it as a calm, courteous process in which you, identify a subject of current or possible debate, right? Analyze why you view the subject the way you do, address others who may not share your view, and to try to persuade them that your view is worth accepting or at least makes sense, right? End quote. So that's the quote from the book, right? And I read that because I think it's a good example of what close reading is, right? And close reading is going to be um, something like everything that we do in this class will revolve around close reading, right? Um, and and close reading really just means that you take a word, a phrase, a scene from any story, right, or a sentence, right, um, and you sort of identify a deeper sort of meaning to to what is on the surface, right? Um, and we will talk more. Next week's reading will be focused mainly on close reading, right? So we will talk more about that at more length next week, right? But I want to sort of introduce you to what close reading is, since you will already be reading this week, right? Um, so yeah, so what that example that I just read, right, is an example of close reading, where the author of the book, right, is taking the word argument or arguing, right, and saying that yes, here's what arguing means on the surface, right? It's combative. It could be violent, right? It could be sort of disrespectful, blah blah blah, right? But actually, here's another way that arguing works, right? Here's a more productive way of thinking about arguing, right? And so by sort of like by making that contrast, I guess, or giving us a different way of understanding the term arguing or argument, right? What the author of the book is doing is close reading the word arguing, right, and giving us a deeper way of, or a more complex way of thinking about the word arguing, right? So that's a very simple, I guess, example of what sort of close reading is, right? And it's to take what something means on the surface, right, and give us expand its meaning, right, or even give us a meaning that is contradictory to what is already perceived, right, about that word, right. And when you find an alternative meaning that is contradictory, right, that's usually a sort of a stronger, or I guess that's a more interesting way, right, of thinking about something that not a lot of people already know, right. Right. So on page one, I'm still on page one. It says here, to argue is to disagree, right? Not in order to win, right? But in order to inquire, right? And so, yeah, when you argue for your interpretation, right? It's not the purpose, I guess, right, of these papers, right, is not to find some kind of absolute answer, right? I don't want I don't want you to think that you'll be arguing in order to say that you're your argument is absolutely right, right? That everyone else is wrong, right? That's not the point of these sort of kinds of arguments, right? Our purpose here is to inquire or to examine or to ask more questions, right? As opposed to just answering questions, right? And so think of it as arguing not in order to win, but in order um, to inquire, right, or to examine something further, right? And so when you're reading the stories, right, and the first story for this week is Flannery O'Connor's Everything That Rises Must Converge, right? You'll want to look for patterns. And like I said before, right, like these, you'll be choosing one of your response papers and expanding that into a longer essay, right, for this class. And so every time you're reading, you want to not just like read about what's going on the surface, right, but you want to be more mindful about what you're reading. So I suggest, when you're reading, make notes, right? If you can, if you have access to a printer, usually for me it's better to print out the PDF and then write notes on the margin, right? Or if you have an iPad, make notes on the margin, or if you just have a computer, you can still make notes, right? So however you want to make notes as you go, right? Because you know you'll feel like you'll remember everything that you read, but once you're done reading, a couple hours later, you'll just forget everything, right? I mean, you won't forget the general story probably, but you'll forget sort of details, right? And so taking notes as you go is very important, right? Um, and so as you're reading, look for patterns, right? And by patterns, I mean, you know, like themes, for example, right? Is there something like religious that repeats? Like, is there a theme of religion, right, that repeats within this story, right? Or is there a certain genre of storytelling that you're noticing, right? Is it sort of like, is it comical? Is it tragic? Or is it tragi-comedy, right? Combination of tragedy and comedy. Is it science fiction? Is it mythological, right? Is it a realist genre, right? So start sort of like thinking about as you read, see if you notice some kind of patterns, right? Is there a pattern of, for especially for this readings, right? Immigrant experience, family relationship that you're noticing, right? Um, is there a romantic sort of narrative that's happening? Is there sort of like a focus on Asian American experience, Filipino American experience, Chicana experience, right? So look for these patterns that's consistent throughout the stories, right? And take note of what these patterns are, what sort of like themes, because that theme, right, that you will identify, that will be the basis of your argument later on, right? Um, right. And so once you've identified a theme, right, that you think are um, that repeat, right, once you recognize a pattern, right, you'll then want to look for specific sentences, specific scenes, specific paragraphs, right, within the story, um, to sort of to support that pattern, right? You want to connect dots, right, in your paper, and so and you want to provide evidence, right? That I think that this pattern um, is consistent throughout the story because here are the examples, right? And those examples will be you pointing out specific scenes, right, in the story. So yeah, as you read, take notes and identify patterns, themes, right? Right. So on page 6, right, we're going to look at the elements of arguments, right? or the elements of argument. And here it's pointing out that a good argument, right, should have an issue. Um, it should um, it should have a main claim, right, and it should have an evidence, right, and it should have assumptions, right. So those are sort of the main elements of an argument, right. And so, you know, as far as the structure of your essay, um, usually, right, what I would be looking for is is a claim, like a claim, or not a claim yet, and the issue, right. So you want to identify a specific issue, right, and that issue, right, uh, that's kind of like a, you know, like a question, right? You want to identify a question, right, about the story, right? And then it's that question that you're then going to answer, right? And so I guess an example, a kind of a simplistic example, right, would be to say that the question is, or the issue is, you know, whether or not um, Flannery O'Connor Flannery O'Connor's story um, is a critique of religion, or it praises religion, right? Um, or that it's doing both, right? It's critiquing, and it's also, or it's uncertain about whether to critique or to praise religion, right? For example, because that's kind of what Flannery O'Connor is known for, is her sort of like subtle way of um, um, depicting religion in a way that you can't really tell, because you know she grew up sort of as a religious person, right? So religion is a very big part of her life, but then she also understands the faults of religion, right? And so she has this kind of uncertainty, right, about how to about what to think about religion, right? Um, and so yeah, so your issue would be could be, you know, something like, is the story uncertain uh, about the role of religion, about the role that religion plays in people's lives, or something like that, right? Um, so you'll want to identify a question, right, that you want to answer, that you want your paper to answer, right? And then the claim would then be your answer, right? So you identify a question, um, and then you want to propose sort of an answer to that question, and that answer does not necessarily have to be, you know, like I said, right? It's not about having an absolute answer, right? It's it could be, you know, the answer could be just a speculation, right? And or just an assumption, right? Or an interpretation, right? And then in the body paragraphs of your essay, so usually, so as far as the structure, right, the introduction will have your will pose the question. You will include the question in your introduction, and then the claim, right, would be included in your thesis, um, in the last sentence of your introduction, right? So that's ideally how, um, you know, some of you, you know, most of you have taken English 1A and 1C, right? Where you learn about the structure, you know, the 5 paragraph structure of essay writing, right? Introduction, thesis, and the last sentence or last 2 sentences of the introduction, 3 paragraphs for the body, and then paragraph conclusion, right? So you have your 5 paragraphs. I require the same structure, right, for our papers for this class, right. So for your introduction, I want to see the question, the issue, and then for the thesis, I want to see your claim, right. What is your interpretation that will address the question, right. And then the body paragraphs will be your proof, will be your reasoning, your assumption, your evidence, right. Your close reading, that will all be sort of included in the body paragraphs, right? So that's when you're going to quote, right, um, from the story, right? And you're not, like I said before, you're not required to do outside research, but I encourage it just so you know what people think, just to kind of like add to your ideas, right? What people are saying about these authors and their works, right? And so it's always good to like know or to read articles about the author, but you're not required that, right? So um, some of you have been in my class before, and you'll know what I look for specifically in papers is quotations, right? I want to know that you know how to use quotes, right? How to incorporate quotes into your own sentences, right? You're not going to quote just for the sake of quoting, right? I want you to pick quotes that are important to your argument, and I want you to analyze each quote that you use, right? And that's a very important thing for me, and a lot of my grading, right, depends upon your ability to incorporate quotations into your writing, right? Um, and yeah, and that's because that will be your evidence, right? Evidence is very important in articulating your claim, right? And so that's why quoting is very important. Right, and on chapter 1, there are 3 example essays, right? That's included here by Paul Goldberger, Disconnected Urbanism. There's also David Barnow's A New Moral Compact, and Regina Rini's Should We Rename Institutions That Honor Dead Racists? Right, so these examples are not necessarily arguments about literature, right? They are just sort of general argumentative essay. And so, yeah, just that's the reason I usually talk about at least one essay example from the chapter, but I realized that these essays, they're not doing close readings of literature, right? And so I did not, it's kind of pointless for me to kind of talk about them for now. So just read them on your own, and just what you can take away from it or from them is just, I guess, the structure of an argumentative essay, right? Kind of look at the introduction and see what they're doing there. Look at the body paragraphs and see how they're providing evidences and how they're quoting, right? How they're incorporating quotations, right? And then look at the conclusion, right? So yeah, so read them and kind of follow them as a guide for how to structure your essay, right? But I will talk next week. I will talk more about, or I will take an example of an essay that's arguing about literature, right? And then I'll talk more about that. But I think these articles are still very helpful, so make sure you read them. And so now I will just move on to chapter 2, right, which is writing effective arguments, right? So chapter 2 is it's an interesting read because it sort of like focuses on style, right? It kind of it it kind of it gives you suggestions, right, on how to style your your writing, your tone, right, your sentences, right. The first chapter sort of like gives you um, the sort of the larger structure of your essay, right. Chapter two sort of like focuses on how sentences work, and how sort of to style your sentences and your tone, right, to make your argument more effective, right. Um, but for me, as style is something that you learn um, in time, right. The more you read, the more you sort of write, right. Then you kind of what we're really doing is just imitating, right. And then after repeatedly sort of like imitating something, um, then you kind of like go against what you're imitating, and then that becomes your style, right. Is something that's like um, slightly against um, what you've imitated before, right. And that's usually how you develop a style, right. And so a good way of having your own style is to just know the basics, right? And then later on, develop your own style once you've sort of like, understood the sort of the foundations, right? And so, you know, style is something that comes in, like, it took me my entire undergrad uh, career to develop some kind of style. And so, yeah, so it's not like it's not, you know, I'm not gonna worry about that, or I'm not going to be very picky about that in your paper, right? Um, yeah. So, but read chapter two because it's interesting, and it sort of like it talks about how you can kind of create a rhythm within your sentences, right? Um, by repeating words, by repeating consonants, right? What's called alliteration, right? Where the first letter, the first consonant, right, of a word is this. You have the same sort of consonants. For example, in one sentence, right? Um, you have multiple consonants, and that makes the sentence kind of rhythmic, right? And I remember, if you're familiar with The Great Gatsby, right? One of the most famous sentences in The Great Gatsby is the last sentence, right? Where it says, "So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past," right? Um, and so what he's doing there, what Fitzgerald is doing there is alliteration of the B's, right? So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past, right? And so by repeating the B's, right, throughout that sentence, he made the sentence very poetic and very rhythmic, right? Um, and first, what that does is, it makes the sentence sound kind of pretty and pleasurable to read, right? Um, and it also makes the sentence memorable, right? It makes, and the fact that I memorize it, that a lot of people memorize it, right? Means that that sentence is very memorable, because it's easy to remember when there's a certain rhythm to a sentence, right? And you don't have to do that in every sentence, right? That's a lot of work. Not even the great writers can do that, every. And it just becomes like, if you do it too much, um, your sentences become too kind of like sing-songy, and that could make it sound a little childish, right? So every once in a while, especially first sentence, last sentence, or first sentence of a paragraph, right? You want those things, those parts to be memorable, right? And so you do stylistic things like that, right? There's also, I'm on page 28 now. There's also what's called assonance, right, which is the repetition of a vowel, right? So alliteration is a repetition of consonants, and then assonance is a repetition of vowels, right? And so those are like stylistic things that you can do, right? But I'm not gonna be picky about it as far as grading your paper, right? Because these are more sort of stylistic things. They're kind of they're just flourishes, right? They're not necessary, right? They just make your writing more sound better, I guess. Right. And so let's look at some examples here. I'm still on page 28, and in the middle of the page, here's what's called balance the parts of a sentence, right? So the examples here are, there's sort of like there's kind of juxtaposition, right? I'll just read the example. When you are in a forest, you want to experience its woodsiness, right? When you are on a beach, you want to feel connected to sand and surf, right? So juxtaposing two things, right? And you can do that by saying, on the one hand, blah 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 blah. On the other hand, blah 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 blah, right? Or you can do, not only does something blah blah blah, but also blah blah blah, right? So those two, that's what we call sort of comparison or juxtaposition or opposition, right? Those things, right, are also, and feel free to use that structure, right? Feel free to imitate these structures. Don't copy the exact words, right? But look at the structure of the sentences here, the examples here, and then imitate that. Put your own words into them, right? And that's perfectly acceptable, right? And also notice, right, when you're in a forest, you want the experience of woodsiness. When you're on a beach, you want to feel connected to sand and surf, right? So there's the alliteration there, sand and surf. That, I don't know. It's pleasant to read, right? And then the second example here, contrast Tom Ridge's world of 1969 with that of America's combat soldiers today, right? So another kind of juxtaposition there. And so speaking of imitating, right, take a look at page 29. And here it's talking about, like on the top, it's talking about using active words, right? And so when you're arguing, you want to use sort of active words. Say, I argue that blah blah blah, right? As opposed to saying I will argue or I have argued, or or adding some kind of qualifier, right? Using an active word or active verb, right? Which is I argue. It gives your tone a sort of a directness, right? And it gives it a sort of an assertive tone, right? Which makes your argument sound strong, right? So that's what they're talking about here, about using active verbs as opposed to passive verbs, right? But then on the bottom of page 29, right, there are examples here of verbs that that you can use, right? Argues, claims, contends, asserts, submits, criticizes, questions, challenges, etc. Right. So I want you to use steal these words, right, and use them, right. Um, when you say, I argue that blah blah blah, what Flannery O'Connor's uh, or Flannery O'Connor's short story claims that blah blah blah, right? Or Flannery O'Connor's short story challenges, right? So take a look at these examples of verbs, right, and use them in your own argument, right, to sort of convey your claim, right? And these verbs are good at sort of really asserting that authority into your own voice, right? So feel free to steal and imitate these words, right? And then page 30 sort of talks about the 5 paragraph essay, right? So take a look at that. And then there's an example on page 33. Feel free to take a look at that also. Right, and then page 36, arguing in the first person, right? So, I don't know if some of your, in my classes, whether it's 1A, 1B, 1C, I always tell my students that they are free to use the I pronoun, right? The first person pronoun, right? In their arguments, right? And some professors say not to use it because it sort of it makes your writing personal and it makes it weak and whatever, right? I don't buy that. I don't care. If an argument is good, it's good. Whether you use I, you, they, whatever pronoun, right? And so, yeah, for the sake of this class, but specifically for the essays that we are writing, right? These are not necessarily research essays. These are interpretations, your interpretations. So I actually encourage you to use the I pronoun, right? The first person, because these are going to be your ideas and your interpretation, right? So I want to see that sort of that tone, right, of the first person in your paper, right? So yeah, I encourage you to use the first person pronoun. Right. So I think I pointed out the important parts that I think are worth pointing out. And so, like I said, there's just no time to talk about everything. Even if we were, in a regular class setting, I would still not be able to talk about everything, right? So I encourage you to email me with questions. If there's parts in the chapters that you're unclear, and you want more explanations about, that's the best time to contact me through email or schedule an office hour, right? So yeah, so that's it for this lecture, and then the next lecture, which will be on Friday, will be about the short story Flannery O'Connor's "Everything That Rises Must Converge." Right. So until then, I'll see you.